My husband called me at 9:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and when I saw his name light up my phone screen, I almost didn't answer. I was exhausted. 12 hours in the cab of a crane in 90-degree heat will do that to you. But something in my gut twisted, and I picked up. Nora. His voice was barely above a whisper, cracked at the edges. Nora, where is she? What? Marcus, what are you talking about? Your mother. She went to the restroom 45 minutes ago and she hasn't come back. The waiter just brought the check and Nora, the bill is $6,000. $6,000. And Mom is standing here looking at me like I'm about to get arrested. I sat up so fast I knocked the TV remote off the nightstand. $6,000. The restaurant, his mother, my mother, and a bill that could have covered my rent for 4 months. Marcus, I said slowly, what did she tell you before she left the table? There was a long pause, long enough that I could hear his mother, Patricia, saying something sharp and indistinct in the background. She said she just had to use the restroom, he finally answered. She said she'd be right back. I closed my eyes. I already knew. I already knew exactly what had happened, and I knew it because I had been watching it build for 11 years. Let me back up. I grew up in Caldwell, Ohio, the kind of post-industrial town that looks like it peaked sometime around 1974 and has been slowly exhaling ever since. The old Renner steel plant closed when I was 9, and after that, most of the storefronts on Main Street followed suit over the next decade, one by one, like dominoes. By the time I was in high school, the biggest employer left was the county hospital, the Dollar General on Route 9, and the freight yard down by the river. I became a crane operator at 23. Not glamorous, I know, but the training program was 18 months, the union card came with it, and the starting pay was better than anything else I could have found in Caldwell without a 4-year degree I couldn't afford. By 35, I was one of only 4 certified overhead crane operators at the Hargrove Industrial Yard, and I was the only woman. I'd learned to ignore the looks a long time ago. The job was good. The job was mine. I met Marcus Delaney when I was 24 at a July 4th cookout at my coworker Brent's house. Marcus was tall, quiet in the way that means he was actually listening rather than just waiting for his turn to talk, and he'd brought a 6-pack of a craft beer I'd never heard of. We talked for 3 hours on Brent's back porch while the fireworks went off somewhere over the river. He was a high school history teacher. He coached JV soccer. He coached because he actually liked kids, not because it padded his salary. I found that out later, and it made me like him even more. We dated for 2 years and got married in June, 11 years ago this past summer. Small ceremony at the Caldwell VFW Hall, maybe 40 people. His family and mine split roughly down the middle. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings. Marcus cried a little during his vows, which made me cry too, and neither of us was embarrassed about it. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Linden Street, 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, and a living room that caught the afternoon light beautifully in the summer. Marcus set up an aquarium along the far wall of the living room about 6 months after we moved in, a 50-gallon tank with a driftwood centerpiece and a rotating cast of freshwater fish. He researched the water chemistry obsessively. He named exactly none of the fish, which he said was important for emotional management purposes. I thought that was ridiculous, and secretly named 3 of them anyway. The big orange cichlid was Gerald. The 2 small tetras that always swam together were Tina and Louise. Marcus didn't know about Tina and Louise. That was fine. Life in those first years was genuinely good in a quiet, unremarkable way. We weren't wealthy. A crane operator and a public school teacher in a shrinking Ohio city don't exactly have a lot of financial runway. But we were stable. We had a savings account, a joint checking account, and a plan to eventually buy a house when the market in Caldwell settled down enough to make it worth it. We had Friday night dinners at Rosario's, the Italian place on 4th Street that had been there since 1988. We had Sunday morning coffee on the apartment balcony. We argued about whose turn it was to clean the aquarium filter and about whether the thermostat should be at 68 or 71. Normal. Beautifully, boringly normal. The problem had a name, and the name was Diane. Diane Calloway was Marcus's mother. She was 61 when Marcus and I got married, recently widowed. Marcus's father had died of a heart attack 18 months before our wedding, and she lived 40 minutes south of Caldwell in a small house in Grange Township that she'd owned for 30 years. She was sharp, organized, and had opinions about everything from my hair to the way I loaded the dishwasher. When Marcus and I were dating, she was merely prickly. Once we got married, she began a slow, patient escalation that I didn't fully recognize for what it was until several years in. It started with health. About 8 months after our wedding, Diane called Marcus on a Wednesday evening, crying. She said she'd been having chest pains. She said she was scared. Marcus drove 40 minutes in the dark to check on her, took her to the ER, sat with her for 4 hours. The ER doctors found nothing wrong. Diane said she was just relieved it wasn't serious. Marcus came home at 2 in the morning, wrung out and pale, and I held him because I thought he'd nearly lost his mother. 6 weeks later, she called again. Dizzy spells this time. Couldn't stand up without the room spinning. Marcus went again. Again, nothing conclusive. The doctors suggested she monitor her blood pressure, maybe adjust her diet. Diane told Marcus that they were missing something, that she could feel it in her bones, that something was definitely wrong with her. I said nothing. I made Marcus dinner when he got home, and I said nothing. By the end of our second year of marriage, I had counted 11 emergency calls from Diane, 11 drives in the dark, 11 ER waiting rooms, 11 rounds of tests that found nothing definitive. Migraines, vertigo, a stomach issue that resolved itself, a rash that turned out to be detergent sensitivity, a heart flutter that her cardiologist described per Marcus as within completely normal parameters. Marcus was worried sick every time. He is a good man with a good heart, and he loves his mother, and Diane knew exactly how to pull that wire. I made the mistake of saying something about it in our third year. We were lying in bed, and Diane had called twice that day, once in the morning because she was too tired to drive and needed Marcus to pick up her prescription, and once in the afternoon because she thought she might be having an allergic reaction to something. Marcus had left work early for the second call. Marcus, I said carefully, do you think it's possible your mom is leaning on you harder than she should be, since your dad passed? He turned his head to look at me. His expression wasn't angry exactly, but it was careful, guarded in a way I hadn't seen before. She's been through a lot, he said. I know she has. I'm not saying she hasn't. I'm just saying 11 ER trips in 2 years, and nothing has ever been seriously wrong. I'm saying that maybe she's my mother, Nora. That was the end of the conversation. I heard the door close on it as clearly as if he'd gotten up and shut a physical door between us. I didn't push. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself that grief did strange things to people and that Diane was doing her best. I told myself that for another 8 years. By the summer of our 11th year, this past July, the hottest July Caldwell had seen in 2 decades, I was 35 years old, 12-hour shifts in a crane cab, still married to a man I genuinely loved, still living on Linden Street, and still watching Diane Calloway run her son like a marionette from 40 minutes south. The fish tank had been upgraded twice. Gerald the cichlid had lived an impressive 5 years before passing on, and had been replaced by a large, deeply unimpressive pleco I quietly named Gerald II. Tina and Louise had not survived year 3. Tetras have a lifespan, but their successors were thriving. Marcus still named none of them. The summer heat that July was extraordinary, the kind that sits on an industrial town like a wet wool blanket. The crane cab had air conditioning that worked about 60% of the time, and on the days it didn't, I came home red-faced and headachy and drank 2 full glasses of water before I even sat down. It was on one of those sweltering evenings, a Thursday in mid-July, when Marcus told me that his mother had called with news. She says the doctors found something, he said. He was standing in the kitchen, still in his work clothes, holding his phone. His face had that particular look, the one I'd learned over 11 years, the one that meant Diane had pressed the wire again. On her last scan, Something on her liver. I set my water glass down on the counter very slowly. What kind of something? I asked. She doesn't know yet. She said the doctor wants to run more tests. She was crying, Nora. He looked at me with those honest, exhausted brown eyes. She sounded really scared. I thought about 11 years of emergency calls. I thought about 11 years of nothing found, nothing serious, all within normal parameters. I thought about how smart Diane Calloway was, and how well she knew her son, and how the timing of this particular revelation came exactly 3 weeks after Marcus and I had started seriously discussing buying a house, which would mean, among other things, that we'd be putting down roots in Caldwell, rather than potentially moving closer to Grange Township, closer to her. I thought about all of that and I said, "We should get more information before we panic." Marcus nodded, but his eyes were already somewhere else. Already 40 minutes south, already in Diane's living room, already hers. 2 weeks later, Marcus suggested we take Diane out to dinner. Somewhere nice, he said. She'd been having a hard time emotionally with the uncertainty of waiting for test results. She deserved a nice evening out. The restaurant he chose was Larkin's, the steakhouse on the edge of downtown that had opened 2 years ago and immediately became the place people went when they were celebrating something or trying to impress someone. I'd been there once for a coworker's birthday. The steaks were extraordinary, and the wine list was the kind you needed a separate evening just to read. I should have paid more attention to how carefully Marcus described the plan. We would meet Diane there, the three of us, have a quiet dinner, make her feel loved and supported. He said it like it was simple. I said sure. I said it sounded nice. That was my last moment of peace for a very long time. The night of the dinner, I came home from the yard at 5:30, showered off 12 hours of heat and grease and industrial smell, put on the blue dress I'd bought for Marcus's school's winter formal 2 years ago, and drove us both to Larkin's. Diane was already there when we arrived, sitting at a table near the window in a silk blouse I hadn't seen before, looking, and I hate that I noticed this, but I did, absolutely fine, healthy, composed, no pallor, no visible distress. She smiled when she saw Marcus and hugged him for a long time. She looked at me over his shoulder, and her smile stayed exactly the same. We ordered. The conversation was polite and careful, the way it always was when the three of us were together. Diane told us about her neighbor's new fence, about a book she'd been reading, about a friend from her church who'd recently been diagnosed with something genuinely serious, which Diane described with a kind of practiced sorrow that I couldn't quite locate as real or performed. Marcus was attentive and warm. I ate my salmon and drank my wine and watched Diane's hands, which were perfectly steady. We were halfway through the main course when Diane set down her fork and pressed her hand lightly to her stomach. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I just need to use the restroom. I'll be right back." She picked up her purse. She always picked up her purse to go to the restroom. I'd never thought about that before. I thought about it right then, watching her stand, watching her lift the leather strap of her purse from the back of her chair and settle it onto her shoulder in one smooth, practiced motion, like she'd been thinking about that moment all evening, like she'd rehearsed it. I watched her walk toward the back of the restaurant, past the bar, around the corner where the restrooms were, and I thought, she took her purse. She always takes her purse to the restroom. Everyone does. It's not a sign. It's not evidence of anything. I picked up my wine glass and took a sip and told myself I was paranoid. 45 minutes later, Marcus's voice was cracking apart on the other end of my phone. I told him to stay at the table. I told him I was on my way. I threw on shoes, grabbed my keys, and drove to Larkin's in 17 minutes flat, which on a Tuesday night with light traffic was actually possible. Marcus was standing near the host stand when I walked in, his face the color of old putty. Patricia, his mother, 61 years old, recently supposedly terrified about something on a liver scan, was nowhere. The waiter, a young guy with a name tag that said Cole, was hovering near the table with the professional patience of someone who has been trained to handle exactly this kind of situation without making a scene. The bill was sitting in the middle of the table in one of those black leather folders. I picked it up. $6,112, plus the suggested gratuity line, which someone, Diane, I realized, because the handwriting matched the birthday card she'd sent me 2 years ago that I'd saved for reasons I couldn't fully explain, had already filled in at 20%. She had filled in the tip line. She had filled in the tip line on a check she never intended to pay. "Nora," Marcus said. His voice was hollow. "I don't understand. She said she was coming right back." I looked at him. I looked at the bill. I looked at Cole, the waiter, who was looking at the middle distance with admirable discipline. And I understood, completely and with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was standing at the end of 11 years of something I had let myself not fully see. "How much did she order?" I asked. Marcus blinked. "What?" "The bill. What did she order that added up to this?" He ran a hand through his hair. She kept asking to see the wine menu. She ordered a bottle, and then another. And the appetizers. She ordered the whole appetizer spread before I could. She said she was celebrating. She said the doctors had called, and the scan was probably nothing, just a shadow, and she wanted to celebrate. I thought it was a good night, Nora. I thought we were having a good night. I set the leather folder back on the table. I opened my wallet. I had one credit card with a limit of $8,000, which I had kept there for exactly the kind of emergency that I had never actually imagined would look like this. I put it on top of the folder. "Nora, you don't have to." "Marcus." I said his name the way you say a word when you're trying to stop time. "I'm going to pay this bill, and then we are going to go home. And tomorrow, when you've slept, I need you to call your mother and I need you to be there for that conversation. Can you do that?" He nodded. He looked like he was 12 years old. Cole processed the card without comment. I added 18%, not 20, not the line Diane had filled in, and signed my name. $6,712 and some cents. Gone in the 30 seconds it takes for a chip reader to process a transaction. We drove home in separate cars. I needed that. I needed the 17 minutes of dark highway with the radio off and just the sound of my own breathing to keep myself from saying something in the car that I could never take back. At home, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I'm so sorry, Nora, I'm so sorry." He said it 4 times. I believed him all 4 times, and it didn't help even once. I lay awake until 2 in the morning while Marcus finally slept beside me, and I did the math. $6,700. My savings account had $11,000 in it, money I'd been setting aside for 2 years toward a down payment on a house. We'd been talking about $30,000 as a target. I was not quite halfway there, and I had just spent $6,700 of it on a dinner I hadn't eaten, hosted by a woman who had walked out a back door. Because yes, I realized, lying there in the dark, of course she'd gone out a back door. Restaurants, like Larkin's, had service exits. She'd have scoped that out, carrying her purse, with a plan that she had been building all evening, while the rest of us ate salmon and took about her neighbor's fence. I thought, she chose this night. The night she announced the scan was probably nothing. The night she framed it as a celebration. The night Marcus was soft with relief and gratitude, and his guard was completely down. I thought, she has been doing versions of this for 11 years, and I have been letting her. I thought, I am done. That thought was the first solid thing I'd felt in a long time. In the morning, I called in a personal day, the first one I'd taken in 14 months, and I sat at our kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down everything I could remember. Every ER visit, every date I could reconstruct from Marcus's schedule, or my own memory, or old text messages I'd saved without knowing why. Every dollar I could document. I went back through my phone's photos because I'd started taking photos of receipts years ago as a habit, a crane operator's habit actually, documenting everything, and I found 3 photos of dinner bills from previous evenings with Diane, where the totals were higher than they should have been, and Marcus had paid without comment. Not $6,000, smaller, $160, $220, $350, consistent enough to be a pattern, small enough to be easy to dismiss. I wrote it all down. I was on my 3rd cup of coffee and my 4th page of notes when my phone rang. Unknown number, Ohio area code, but not local. I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up. "Is this Nora Delaney?" "It is," I said. "My name is Ruth Ann Pollock. I'm not sure if you know who I am. I was a friend of Marcus's father, of Robert's. I've been trying to find a way to reach you privately for about 2 weeks, and I wasn't sure I had the nerve until this morning." I set down my coffee cup. Ruth Ann Pollock spoke for the next 22 minutes without stopping. She was 73 years old, had lived 3 houses down from Diane and Robert Calloway for nearly 2 decades, and had watched Robert's health decline in the last years of his life with the particular attention of someone who genuinely loved him as a friend. She told me that in the 8 months before Robert's heart attack, the heart attack that had killed him, that had started Diane's long campaign of emergency calls and medical theater, Robert had confided in her that he was planning to separate from Diane. He had spoken to an attorney. He had documented, over the preceding 4 years, a pattern of financial behavior that Ruth Ann described with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed saying it out loud. Diane had been taking money from their joint account in increments small enough not to trigger automatic alerts, depositing it into an account in her name only, and had accumulated, by Robert's estimate, somewhere between $80,000 and $90,000 without his knowledge. Robert had been building a case. He had copies of statements. He had the name of an attorney in Columbus. And then he had died. And whatever he had built, whatever he had documented, had gone with him, because no one had known to look for it, and Diane had been the surviving spouse, and everything had passed to her. "I kept quiet," Ruth Ann said, and her voice cracked on the word quiet, in a way that told me exactly how much it had cost her. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself she'd lost her husband. Whatever else she was, she'd lost him. And then I heard from my daughter, who heard from someone at her church, that Diane had a liver scare. And I thought, I need to call that girl. My hand was gripping the phone so hard my knuckles had gone white. "How do you know it wasn't a real scare?" I asked. "Because my daughter works the administrative desk at Grange Township Medical Associates," Ruth Ann said quietly. "And Diane Calloway has not had a liver scan. She has not had any imaging done there in the past 8 months. Now, she could have gone somewhere else, but Diane has been going to that practice for 30 years. She wouldn't go somewhere else." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a truck rumbled past on Linden Street. Gerald II was probably hovering somewhere near the bottom of the fish tank in the living room, doing whatever plecos do. "Ruth Ann," I said slowly, "do you still have any of what Robert documented? Did he ever give you anything?" There was a pause that lasted long enough that I started to think the call had dropped. "He gave me a USB drive," she said, "about 3 weeks before he died. He said, 'Ruthie, if anything happens to me, give this to someone who can use it.' I've had it in a fireproof box in my hall closet for almost 12 years. I didn't know who to give it to. I didn't know if it was even still readable." I was already writing her address on the legal pad. "I can be in Grange Township in 40 minutes, I said. Ruth Ann Pollock lived in a beige ranch house with a concrete goose figurine by the front door, wearing a hand-knitted sweater even in July. She opened the door before I even knocked, which told me she'd been watching for my car from the window. She was a small woman, wide through the shoulders with white hair cut close, and eyes that had the particular sharpness of someone who had spent decades watching things carefully and keeping what they saw to themselves. She put the USB drive in my hand without preamble. It was a plain black thumb drive, the kind that used to come free with a rebate at office supply stores. It felt weightless. I could not believe how many years were compressed into something that weighed nothing at all. "I need you to know," Ruth Ann said, standing in her narrow entryway with her arms crossed, "that I am not doing this lightly. Robert was my friend. I don't want his memory dragged through anything ugly." "I understand," I said. "Do you?" She looked at me steadily. "Because what's on that drive, if it's still readable, it's not just about Diane. It's about a marriage. It's about a man's last years. I've been sitting with it for 12 years because I didn't know if using it would honor him or just make a mess." "Ruth Ann," I said, Robert spent the last months of his life building a case because he wanted the truth to mean something. I'd like to honor that." She was quiet for a moment. Then she unfolded her arms and said, "There's a laptop on the kitchen table. Let's see if the thing even works." It worked. 12 years old, stored in a fireproof box, and it worked. The drive contained 3 folders. The first was labeled Statements and held scanned copies of joint bank records going back 4 years before Robert's death, with individual transactions highlighted in yellow and a running tally in a separate spreadsheet. Diane had been moving money out in amounts ranging from $200 to $1,200, always in cash withdrawals, never more than once in the same week. The total, per Robert's spreadsheet, was $83,400 over 41 months. The second folder was labeled Attorney and contained a scanned letter from a family law practice in Columbus, a firm called Whitmore and Sable, confirming a consultation appointment that Robert had scheduled 2 weeks before his heart attack. He had never made it to that appointment. The third folder was labeled Ruthie and contained a single document, a letter addressed to Ruth Ann, dated 3 weeks before Robert died, written in the slightly formal prose of a man who had been a high school history teacher for 30 years before he retired. It said, "I don't know if any of this will ever matter, but I want someone to know that I tried. If something happens to me before I can finish this, give it to whoever needs it most." I sat in Ruth Ann Pollock's kitchen for a long time after I finished reading that. "I'm going to make copies," I said finally. "With your permission, I'm going to take this to an attorney, and I'm going to make sure that whatever happens next, this is part of the record." Ruth Ann nodded once, slowly, like a woman releasing something she had carried for a very long time. I called Marcus from the car in Ruth Ann's driveway. He picked up on the second ring, and I could tell from the sound of his voice that he hadn't slept well, that he'd been sitting with the wreckage of last night, trying to make it into something that made sense. "I need you to meet me at home," I said. "I need to show you something. And Marcus, I need you to let me show you all of it before you say anything. Can you do that?" There was a pause. "Nora, what's going on?" "I'll explain everything when you get there. Just come home." He was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in 30 minutes later. I set my laptop on the table, plugged in the drive, and I sat down across from him, and I walked him through every folder, every highlighted transaction, every line of his father's careful, heartbroken spreadsheet. I didn't editorialize, I didn't frame it, I just let him read. Marcus is not a man who cries easily. He cried at our wedding vows, and I had loved him for it, and in 11 years I had not seen him cry since. He cried sitting at our kitchen table on a Wednesday morning in July, reading his dead father's letter to Ruth Ann Pollock, and I reached across the table and held his hand and didn't say a word. When he finished, he closed the laptop very carefully, the way you close something you're afraid of breaking. "She did this to him," he said. His voice was flat, not a question. "Yes." "And last night, the dinner, that was—" "Yes." He sat with that for a long time. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere on Linden Street, that particular suburban drone that means ordinary life continuing without interruption. "What do I do?" he finally asked. "I made an appointment," I said. "Tomorrow morning, with an attorney. Her name is Carla Fontaine. She does estate and civil litigation. She came recommended by someone at my union office. I told her the basics over the phone this morning, and she said we have something to work with. I want you to come with me." He looked at me. "You made the appointment this morning?" "While you were sleeping." Something moved through his face, grief and gratitude, and something that looked like shame, which I understood, and something that looked like relief, which I understood even more. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry I didn't see it." "She was very good at being your mother," I said. "That was the whole point." Carla Fontaine was a compact woman in her early 50s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular manner of someone who had heard a great many terrible stories and had learned to receive them without flinching. She listened to everything, reviewed the drive contents, and was quiet for almost 2 full minutes before she spoke. "The financial documentation from the marriage is 12 years old," she said, "but it establishes a behavioral pattern, combined with last night's incident, which I'd classify as fraud with intent to evade, given that she ordered knowing she had no intention of paying, and given that you have the physical bill, the credit card statement, and a waiter who can place her at the table, you have the foundation of a civil claim. I won't promise you $6,000 back in a courtroom. I will tell you that a formal demand letter, sent certified mail, with this documentation attached, has a reasonable chance of producing a settlement without litigation. What about the $83,000? Marcus asked. Carla looked at him steadily. That's more complicated. The statute of limitations on civil fraud in Ohio is 4 years from discovery. Robert discovered it, or was in the process of discovering it before he died. You're discovering it now. There's an argument to be made that the clock starts at your discovery, not his. I won't tell you it's a certainty. I'll tell you it's worth pursuing. We authorized her to send the demand letter. She had it drafted, reviewed, and sent certified mail within 4 business days. It was 3 pages long, detailed, and included scanned copies of the bank statements, Robert's spreadsheet, and the credit card statement from Larkins. It requested reimbursement of $6,712 for the dinner and formally notified Diane that her late husband's financial records had been recovered and were under legal review. Diane called Marcus the morning the letter arrived. I was at work, 40 feet up in the crane cab, when he texted me. She called. She's furious. I didn't pick up. I texted back. Good. She left a voicemail. Marcus played it for me that evening, and I listened to it once all the way through, Diane's voice cycling through indignation and wounded maternal sorrow, and then something that cracked at the edges in a way that told me she was genuinely scared. She said the dinner was a misunderstanding. She said she'd intended to pay but had felt ill. She said the documents Marcus had apparently found were taken out of context and that Robert had always misunderstood her financial management. She said she hoped Marcus could see that she was being attacked by his own wife. Marcus listened to it with me, standing in the kitchen, and when it ended, he deleted it without replying. 6 weeks later, Diane's attorney contacted Carla Fontaine. They settled. Diane paid back the $6,712 from the dinner within 30 days and agreed to a separate payment of $22,000 toward the marital asset claim. Not the full $83,000, but enough to be real, enough to mean something, enough that Robert's spreadsheet had finally been used for the purpose he'd built it for. The agreement included a mutual release clause and a clause that Carla had specifically insisted on. Formal written acknowledgement that the dinner at Larkins had been intentionally left unpaid. She signed it. She put her name on a document that said, in the careful language of a legal agreement, that she had done what she had done. I don't know exactly what that cost Diane internally. I suspect very little. People like Diane Calloway have a remarkable capacity for reframing their own history. But I know what it meant to me, and I know what it meant to Marcus, and I know what I think it would have meant to Robert, and that was enough. The $22,000 went into our house fund. Combined with what I'd already saved, we had enough to close on a 2-bedroom house on Clement Street 8 months later, a brick bungalow built in 1952 with a deep backyard and a kitchen that needed updating and a front porch with morning light that reminded me a little of the balcony on Linden Street. The inspection turned up nothing alarming. We closed on a Friday in late March. Marcus carried a box of fish tank equipment through the front door and immediately started measuring the living room wall. Marcus and his mother have not spoken since the letter arrived. I don't know if that will be permanent. I don't know if it should be. That's not my decision to make, and I have stopped trying to make it for him. What I know is that he made it himself, quietly, without me pushing, on the morning he deleted Diane's voicemail and set his phone face down on the counter and stood there looking out the kitchen window for a long time. Ruth Ann Pollock came to our housewarming. She brought a dish of baked ziti and a card that said, in her looping handwriting, "Robert would have liked you." I put the card in the same drawer where I keep my grandmother's pearl earrings. Gerald II, the Plico, made the move to Clement Street without complaint. He is a deeply unimpressive fish, and I love him unreasonably. Marcus still has not named a single fish in that tank, which I still think is ridiculous, and I still secretly name them. And that particular argument, the quiet, running, good-natured argument about the fish, is one of the things I like best about my life. Here is what I know now that I didn't fully understand before. The cost of not seeing something is not zero. Every time I told myself I was being uncharitable, every time I said nothing and made dinner and let it go, I was paying. Not always in dollars, though eventually in dollars too, but in the slow, cumulative cost of a person choosing not to trust her own clear eyes. I was a crane operator. My whole job was precision. My whole job was understanding load and weight and exactly how much stress a structure could bear before something gave. And I had been standing next to a structure that was failing for 11 years, telling myself I was probably wrong about what I was seeing. I wasn't wrong. I'd never been wrong. And the thing I want to remember, the thing I make myself sit with on the mornings when it would be easier to let it blur into a story about a difficult mother-in-law and a bad dinner and a lucky USB drive, is that the moment I decided to trust what I had seen was the moment everything changed. Not the attorney, not the letter, not the settlement. The moment at 2 a.m. when I lay awake doing the math, and instead of talking myself out of what I knew, I picked up a yellow legal pad and started writing it down. That was the moment. Everything else was just the load following the line.